I think we're good to go.
Okay.
That's awesome. I'm glad that it's working now, and I'm very glad that we're talking, man. I'm really excited about this. And just to give you a little bit of a glimpse as to why, even though we talked a little through email, I I this will only be episode 11, so I'm still near the beginning, but I've had a few other people interested in different avenues of spirituality and Christian mysticism. And I have a rabbi coming up later and some cool stuff. But I personally, um, Ram Dass is definitely someone who opened a lot to me. So there's just I'm just excited to share that. I think there's some I've the people that have gotten back to me about listening to the episodes, a lot of them are just not um committed to any specific spirituality, just listening and learning. And so that makes me a little bit more excited to talk to you and share some of Ram Dass and Neem Karoli Baba and some of this avenue. So thank you.
Yeah. No, and thanks for asking me. The truth is, conversations like this really feed me. Um, I've I've rarely. That's not true. There's been twice that I turned down podcast interviews because I didn't really feel like it was going to be the right fit. But when it seems like uh, there's an alignment in terms of the conscious space that we both want to be in together, I'm it's too hard for me to want to turn that down. I mean, this really fuels me a lot, so I'm excited.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. And I finished your book today. I read through it this week. Absolutely loved it. I mentioned in an email, and I'll say it to you again so others can hear that first poem. Just I
Mm.
immediately felt like tears in my eyes and laughing at the same time. And what I love about that is I always find that if tears come and laughter comes, I feel like there's some truth. Something got
Mm.
exposed, and I felt that good exposure in that way when I read that. So, but how I kind of want to start um, is because I think some listeners will be new. I don't want to just jump in assuming everyone knows Ram Dass and
Sure.
Neem Karoli Baba. So I would love for you to kind of give maybe just a foundational, basic kind of intro to Ram Dass and his guru, and maybe some anything that kind of comes up in terms of their teachings or whatever, just to kind of give us a background.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'll start by saying, in a way, I might not be even the right person to give that kind of introduction. Not that I mean, I can do it and I will. But what I'll start is by saying who Ram Dass was to me, and I'll actually go from there. And I think everyone will get all the important pieces from it.
Perfect.
But when I was in my early 20s, I had the chance and I got to go and spend time with him and be with him. And I spent 3 years on Maui. And the majority of that time I was living at the house with him, working for him. And at that point in time, as probably many, but maybe not all of your listeners know, he had had a stroke. And so he was in a wheelchair and he had aphasia, which meant that he had trouble speaking. Words came slow. And so I was there. They just always like to have a younger person there. At that point in time, Dasima was her name. She was the one doing the majority of the caregiving, but she was also older. And so they wanted to have one young person there in case just extra help was needed if he fell, and then also just to help out with other things around the house. And so that was my role. And it was such a formative time for me because I got to be with a spiritual teacher at the end of his life after a lifetime of practice and the ups and downs of life and the pitfalls and the mistakes and the learning from them. And then also because of the stroke, he couldn't speak in the same way. And that forced him to really sit in a deeper space in his consciousness. And what a lot of the people that knew him for a long time would say was that what he had previously talked about and taught, now he was a true embodiment of it. And that was my experience. And his number one teaching at the end of his life was loving awareness. That at the core of our being, deeper than our mind, deeper than our body, deeper than any thought or emotion or social role, the ups and downs of life, what we are at our true depth of essence is consciousness itself. And that consciousness is no different than love. So it's naturally loving. Thus the words loving awareness. And that was his teaching. That's also what I experienced from him. I mean, he was a true embodiment of that, such that he couldn't speak very well. He would often struggle with words. And because I was living with him, I was with him in moments when he wasn't necessarily on, right? He wasn't on a stage. So he was very human. And I saw him struggle with dependency issues. I saw him struggle with being grumpy sometimes, physical pain. I saw all of that human stuff. And yet, he truly rested in that loving awareness. Like it was a stable presence for him throughout the day, and it was palpable. I mean, being around it, I could just feel it. And that taught me a couple things. One, that it's real, that this loving awareness that we can read about in all these holy texts, all these religious spiritual teachings, that it's real. And two, because Ram Dass was human, never pretended not to be human, and because I saw him and related to him as a human, that meant that it was my birthright too. That what I experienced from him, that thing that was so special and so seemingly rare, that was something that I can aspire to in my life, and that is real for me right now in this moment, that this loving awareness is real and I can rest in it. Even me, right, with all of my stuff. And so that's who Ram Dass is to me, and that's why he's important. But of course, why I was first attracted to him is the reason why most people are, which was, he was a Harvard psychologist, had a PhD in psychology, and he was there during the time that psychedelics came into the culture, right? We're at this really interesting full spectrum thing where we're having this renaissance right now. But even 10, 15 years ago, we were still very much in a different culture. And he was at this ripe time where it wasn't illegal yet because no one fully knew what it was, and actively studying things like LSD and entheogenic mushrooms and what were the effects that these had on consciousness. And he was there with Timothy Leary doing that. And it's a much longer story, but the short of it is that through some controversies and because of the taboo and the newness of psychedelics, and also because of some poor choices that he made, getting sloppy with some of the stuff that they were doing, him and Tim Leary got kicked out of Harvard. He was the first person in like 100 years as a tenured professor to get kicked out of Harvard. And that really sent him on a whole spiritual journey of, for a while, he dove headfirst into psychedelics. His sole purpose being that he wanted to really understand the depth of consciousness itself. It was a spiritual quest. And at that time, there wasn't as much of a spiritual context as we have now. And so he didn't have necessarily the same framework or container for these experiences that maybe we have now. So he just kept diving in until ultimately came to the conclusion that he was never going to fully get what he wanted from that. And so that led him to India on a spiritual search. And that's where he met his guru, Neem Karoli Baba, who was a being. And I've not only talked to Ram Dass about this, but I've got to talk to a whole spectrum of people that were around him at that time. And yes, because he is said to be a siddha, a perfected being, a being that not only is he the embodiment of this loving awareness, like we all are, but a being where that's all that was there, right? A true crystal clear mirror. And so all of the people that are around him, they talk about the miracles, all of that stuff that you could read about if you're reading about any other Siddha, either from the Tibetan tradition or maybe Jesus or whoever. But what's fascinating is when you talk to them, they don't even really care. You kind of have to like get them to tell you a miracle story. They don't really care. The number one thing they all talked about, it's universal. Everyone has their own perspectives, but they all talk about that loving awareness that he was and that they felt in his presence, and that transformative impact, sometimes just meeting him one time, spending one day with him, that one impact had on their life. And Neem Karoli Baba is the person that gave Ram Dass his name, Ram Dass. Before that, he was Richard Alpert, PhD.
Mm-hmm.
And Ram Dass means servant of God. And that sent Ram Dass on a path of his own spiritual journey of devotion, service. And then he took that to the West at a time when this was all very new. And so that put him as he was in that right position at the right time to be one of the preeminent spiritual teachers. And besides that, he also was maybe one of the most skilled orators, at really taking these spiritual teachings in a way that can be accessible, at least to the specific audience that he was speaking to. And that was the Ram Dass that I first came attracted to when I found his books and learned about him. And that's why I was interested. But then when I sought him out, that's when I got to relate to an even deeper Ram Dass. So that's my answer to your question. Did I cover
Yeah.
it?
Oh yeah, yeah. I appreciate it too, because I know just like I said, I wanted to give some context and let someone who may have never heard some of these stories that might spark an interest, or like it did for so many other people. And what I really like is there's a lot of things that even in your book you brought up about being with Ram Dass and the tools that you gain from certain experiences, and especially, I mean, I guess all experiences, but that one in particular. And there was you mentioned in the book, I think, driving with him, and you mentioned two separate things that I found just like stood out to me as like such uh important tools. And you mentioned silence and you mentioned humor, and I
Mm.
was like, oh man, that's like I feel like just those two. I mean, there's so much more, but just those two are so important. And it's so interesting because, you know, humor, for example, if we start with that, like just laughing with someone, even if it's not has nothing serious, like just the silliest thing, just being silly, it's like that has power to it. So I would love for you to speak a little bit about silence and humor and how they might actually tie into someone's spirit.
Yeah. Well, the Ram Dass I knew was incredibly comfortable with silence, such that if I didn't have anything to say, we could just sit together for an hour plus just in silence and be content. And one of the effects of his stroke was that his sense of time, I mean, there were certain things that were difficult for him. He was still able to speak and teach and be very concise and precise, especially when his energy levels were good, even though language came slow. And people would still be glued to every word. But a lot of that was him learning to see what his strengths were and to lean on those, because there were some things that were difficult. And one of those was numbers, was very difficult, and his sense of time. And so we would always have dinner at the same time every night. And there was this is in Hawaii, so the back lanai, which just means it's the back patio where we would eat. And one day Ram Dass came down and it was an hour before dinner. And so I wasn't sure if he knew, and I saw him down there. And so I just went out and I said, Ram Dass, dinner's not for another hour. He said, oh, really? I said, yeah. He said, huh, I guess I'll just sit here. I said, okay. And I went up and I was helping with dinner. And I would look out the window periodically, and he was just sitting there, just looking out at the ocean and the view. And yeah, in a way, Hawaii, it makes it easy to be present. But another way, I didn't get the sense that he was meditating like the way that I would, where it was, I'm here, I'm doing this practice. He just was in a meditative space. He was just there, present in that silence. I'm sure there was thoughts passing through, but it was clear that he wasn't thinking. That's not what he was doing. So uh, he was very comfortable with both that inner and that outer silence. And the other thing about him was I had all these ideas in my mind about what it would be like when I lived there with him. And I just thought I would get all these spiritual teachings all the time. And it wasn't really like that. I mean, he didn't want to be giving me spiritual lectures all day. I mean, that's what he did for his job, right? When
Mhm.
people invite him to speak. So it really was just being together like humans. And so left to his own devices, he was funny. I mean,
Mhm.
he had a great sense of humor. And it was a joy of mine to try and make him laugh. Like I
Right.
loved it. I would always
Right.
just try and come up with ways to make him laugh. I loved his laugh. And and he was still really witty. And so here's a story. Uh, there was one, I think there was two times, the time that I was there, that he fell out of bed. Um, at that time, he could still transfer himself in and out of bed at night to go to the bathroom. Towards the end of my time, that wasn't possible anymore, right? Because as he aged, he lost more and more abilities. Arms got less strong. But at that time, he still could. And so if at night he had to go to the bathroom, he would get out of his bed, get into the wheelchair, go to the bathroom. And there was two occasions when he fell, and that was pretty dangerous because no one else was up. We were asleep. We didn't have great systems in place at that time. And so this one night he had fallen out of bed, and uh, he had been on the ground for a while. And Dasima, who was the older woman that really she was the one running the show and was his primary caretaker and like everything. I mean, if there was one person I would credit for helping him stay as alive and well for as long as he was, it would be her. Um, yes, he had amazing doctors, and I credit all of them. I mean, I'm seeing their faces in my mind, but Dasima was the one there at the house making sure that he got the care he needed. And so somehow, well, she actually had a dream. I'll just tell the full story. I'll give the full
Good.
darshan. She had a dream where she heard Ram Dass crying out for help. And so she woke up and went upstairs to check on him, and he was on the floor, and he had not been crying out for help. He had no idea how she was there or how that happened. And things like that just happened at the house. Um, so she came down to get me, and I wish I was in on the miracle, but like I was dead asleep, and she's like
Mhm.
shaking me awake.
Right.
I'm like groggy, like what's going? You got to come up and help
Yeah.
Ramdas. So I go up, I help him get up, I help him get in bed, and Dasima are just both standing there, just looking at him. Our jaws are open, like like what just happened? And Ramdas sees that there's this silence, and he says, "Well, that's all, folks."
That's
And it was just the purest laughter came of us,
right.
right? And the fact that I mean, he just we didn't know at that time. Like he had to go to the doctor after and get checked out. And I mean, those things could be really dangerous for him. And the fact that he just had that happen and that was his go-to
Right.
to effortlessly tell a joke. I
Right.
think gives a snapshot of who he was. Yeah.
Right. I mean, sometimes that just cuts through like so much, and to hear that is pretty good. And I I mean, I usually when I'm able to, there's a local Vedanta temple that I'm lucky enough to be asked to help at on occasion, and then even luckier to be able to have lunch with the swamis sometime.
Mm,
And I go there for lecture every week, but I'll tell you, like sitting at lunch when they start making jokes and making each other laugh, it's just like I'm like, oh, this I could watch all day. Like, or on the occasion I've made them laugh, like you said, I just want to like, oh, when I leave,
mm,
I'm lit up when I leave there because I'm like, it just feels so good maybe to share that. And and that kind of brings me to another thing that I'm curious, because like I said, I am able to help there, not to the extent that you were with Ramdas, but I do have this pesky thing of wanting them to see me as special, like wanting to be the
mm.
special boy and wanting to
Yeah.
like, and then spiraling the other way if like they don't ask me to help for a couple weeks and then all of a sudden, oh, I must be the and there's all this attachment to that experience, even though when I'm there just sweeping the leaves or whatever is the thing that feels so good, but I forget it so quickly, with that need to be special. I wonder, did you feel any of that, any of those really challenging kind of human feelings of what's he think of me, or anything like that?
Yeah. I had a dream actually. I had only been living at the house for, I don't know, maybe it was a month or two, a few weeks. It was early on in the time. And I had a dream. And in the dream, there was two different Ramdases. One was the famous Ramdas, and the other was the Ramdas I lived with. And when I woke up from that dream, the messaging was very clear, which was that I wasn't fully comfortable with him, right? That the projections and my own insecurities and all of that was preventing me from really dropping in and being with the being that was there that I was living with. And that was a profound realization. But it still didn't, right? That didn't like change things overnight, right? It just pointed to something that over time, I did get more comfortable and that did start to fall away more and more. But yeah, but of course, I wanted Ramdas to see me as special and because of that, that got in the way of certain things. I think there's ways I could have used my time there more effectively. Like I could have asked for guidance on more things or wisdom on more things or shared more of my insecurities in the moment so I could actually work with them, right? But because of my own anxieties about doing that, fears of being seen, there was a lot of ways that I protected myself, right? And that wasn't because of him, you know, uh, that was just where I was at. And so, yeah, I think that that's just very human. I think that's just a part of it. I think when we're around these powerful beings that have wisdom and our stuff's going to come up. And also, when we're in a context of spiritual teachings and when we're in relationship to beings that are actively resting in their awareness and seeing us as awareness, it makes it easier to see that stuff that's always present, but that we're
Mm,
not always as conscious of. And that's rich. I mean, what a beautiful thing, right? That you get to watch your mind go through this stuff that's probably there in every relationship that you're a
right.
part of.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. You kind of closed that with something that I was thinking as you were getting there. I was like, oh, you know what? I'm probably always doing that in some degree. And so yeah, you're right. It is nice to have someone or some experience shine a light on maybe some of the things that are getting in your way a little bit, so that's really interesting. There and with being with Ramdas, and then your kirtan practice and your devotional, just any of your devotional practices, which clearly are very important to you. It's what I find, or one of the thoughts that kind of came to me was that, a lot of people, we have our regular jobs and our regular relationships and our texting and our all our stuff, all the regular day-to-day stuff. And a lot of people, you'll always hear this, and maybe you also, but you hear, if I just want to get off the grid, I just want to be gone. If I could just like live away from everything, everything would be fine. And, a lot of people hang on this probably false truth that if they just weren't here, things would be good. And in some fashion, you could argue that you kind of in a way were, took a step away from the typical day-to-day human experience in the West, and did, you know even though you were doing a lot of human things, spend more time in spiritual space and with your devotional practices. And then what I found really, um what I think you probably have a cool and interesting perspective on is then coming back, and now those practices and those lessons, utilizing them in your day to day, you know, just regular. I don't really like to say regular, but you understand where I'm going.
Yeah.
The stresses and the meetings and the whatever you're doing. So how did you find that, time with your devotional practices, and then transferring that into real life? Um, like, maybe talk about the transition, and then any way that it's impacted it. It's some reason to like say that these practices are actually valuable in
Yeah.
not just that space.
Yeah. So that's a great question, by the way. And there's a lot there. So I'll separate them into a few different things.
Cool.
One is that for me, it actually was really important that I did that. Um, I don't think that's true for everyone. And I think in a lot of situations, thinking that just causes excess suffering in our life. Um, but for me, it really was. So when I had my first real ground shaking transpersonal spiritual experiences, I was fairly young. I was 19, really, was my first
Mm,
hint at it. But really, when I was 20 and 21, where like to my core, just my reality was shaken, and and it just kind of left me like, what the fuck? I mean, really, And I was enrolled in college, because at that time, that's what we were all told, right? I'm very
right.
much a millennial, older millennial. So
Right.
after high school, you go to college, um, and so I was there. But I also came of age after 9/11 and the Bush presidency, and I just had a real deep questioning of everything and culture, and I was very dissatisfied with it all and the messages that I was being told. And I also wasn't really, uh, I grew up in an alcoholic home, and I had a lot of insecurities and anxieties, and uh, I, I just had a lot of mental health stuff that I wasn't even at a place where I could fully admit that to myself, right? So there was a lot going on with me at that time when I had those openings. And so I almost didn't graduate college because of it, because I just, like, what am I doing? I like barely scraped through. And then I did drop out everything. And I lived out of my car for a while. I mean, I lived a very extreme life, in
Mm,
terms of tree sits with anarchists
Oh
and,
wow.
off the grid permaculture, and then, finding my way to Ram Dass's, which was really where I was able to really deeply stabilize into something. And once I had stabilized in it, right, where just the parts of my ego that needed to strengthen in some way, uh, the psychological work, the healing that needed to be done, right? Once that had happened, and also when I could really rest in this faith that I knew to be true, uh, once that had all happened to a certain degree, then the calling came, to go back out into the world. And there was a lot of unknown there. And then that's really when the path deepened for me was, what does all this mean? This deep truth I found. What does it mean when I'm working multiple minimum wage jobs and just trying to like pay my bills for this apartment that has bars in the windows, and like, you know, what do the spiritual teachings mean now,
Right.
right? And really, as much as I've kicked and screamed along the way, and I've still had thoughts sometimes, maybe I just need to go back to an ashram or whatever. The truth is I do think that this has really been what's been deepening my wisdom. Like this is what I needed, was this. If I stayed living, if I went on and tried to be a monk or whatever my ideas were at whatever point in time, um, I think that would have been an act of me running away from life. I think that doing the stuff I'm doing now, very much in the world, finding ways to be of service, being in I have a long-standing relationship with my life partner of over 10 years, uh, all these type of things, having cats, you know, these are the things that when I'm now teaching, these are the things that I'm pulling my wisdom from. I mean,
Mhm.
really, these daily experiences. So I needed that. And that's a beautiful thing that we have containers that exist out in the world, so that if there are people and they do truly need that, and if they're able to do it, I mean, what a brave and beautiful act to go and do that. And really, not everyone does. And there's been some repercussions. I mean, a big part of my journey has been letting go of the black and white extremes that live in my head about what it means to be a conscious being.
Mhm. Right. Right. I also have to just say your story is very interesting to the point where tree sitting with anarchists is just a quick side note. Like
Yeah.
I haven't yet on any conversation in my life had someone use that little snippet. So it was just fly by that, and but it is true though. Like all the things that got you to where you went, and I love that you said stabilize. Like you needed something to kind of, because man, I mean we are kind of thrashing with the waves of existing, right? Like life is
Yeah.
just the waves don't stop. I mean, the water might still for a while, but they're coming. And so you're in it. So if we're dropped in the ocean and just going everywhere, any life vest that we can have, whether and if that's a devotional practice or if that's, a community of any kind, because I know that, just talking about, yeah, I mean, even just being in the culture we're in, like the just using terms like God and stuff is challenging, even for me,
Yeah.
because I'm, I sometimes, there'll be times where I'll read something and I'll be like, right now I'm still feeling a lot of stuff about these words that I have to like unravel or whatever. But so whatever stabilizes you, I think that's a really good, simple word to kind of express that idea of just anything that kind of works in that way for you. So I really liked that word just like kind of shined
Mm.
extra bright when you said that. Um, and it's interesting because I was reading today. I picked up the biography of Swami Vivekananda.
Uh-huh.
Right. And it's interesting because in the and I kind of started the book over because I had started it a while ago and not finished, and then went back. And just today, he was at a point in the beginning of his journey where his I think his father died, and then he was had to be the breadwinner for the household, and then for a second was just like, what are all these teachings doing for my real life right now when I have 8 mouths to feed? And eventually he couldn't resist the pull to Kali and Ramakrishna, and that's his story. But that was the thing that kind of stabilized him. But that idea also that when you're in the midst of the really harsh waves, it's also okay to just be like, I don't know what any of this is. I don't like the frustration. I feel like, and this is maybe something that you could talk about, just the because it sounds so good. Like when you're talking, it sounds so like soft and nice and like, oh, I just want to do that. Let's just be in that loving awareness. That sounds nice. Where do you get what drive through do I go through to pick
Mm,
up my loving awareness? But the frustration of it, the frustration of exploring yourself and how you connect to what is. Maybe talk about that if you could.
yeah. Well, in a way, uh, it is really nice, right? I mean, loving awareness, it's a much nicer, softer way to relate to the world. Uh, in another sense, we have this idea of love. It's one of the working models because I work a lot with people one on one, and also just in my own inspections, I've found that there's this working model of love as like this soft blanket that we can kind of layer over everything, and it'll just make everything feel a little bit better. But when we have that model, that's there's actually a lot of tension in that, and there's fear in it because it means that whatever these things are that we want to cover up, that there's something wrong with them,
Mm.
right? That we have to add something for that to for the love to be present there. And that's why uh, it can feel like there's this contrast between that soft presence of loving awareness and the frustrations of that exist of being a human in today's world with paying the bills and climate change and body tension and death and dying and disease and grief and all of it, right? So, but another model, and what I think is a more accurate model, or maybe a more skillful model, is that loving awareness allows all of it. So it's not that we're allowing these experiences in a way that makes it so that frustrations don't so that the frustrations don't arise. It's that we're relating to even the frustrations themselves in a softer way, right? So that when those frustrations come, we can soften around them. And we don't have to fight with ourselves quite so much, so that if fear arises, anger arises, sadness arises, grief, that we can actually just allow all of that and we can make friends with the totality of our being. And it's also doing that, and it's a way we're becoming more intimate with these things because we're not fighting and struggling with them as much. But in another sense, we're also gaining a greater vantage point so that it's not just frustration that's there or whatever it is, but there's also the space around it, right? And that all of it is being held in this sky of loving awareness. And so that's really, I mean, yes, I get it. It all feels very romantic and pretty when it's being said. And even me saying that
Mm.
sounds like that. But like fear, for instance, that's hard. That's a hard one to work with. Like intense body pain, that's difficult. That is difficult to work with. And uh, softening around those things is actually bringing a little bit of ease, right? So even though it's hard to do in a sense, another sense, that's what we're doing is we're bringing more ease into these difficult experiences because why make it harder than it needs to be?
Right. Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. It feels like when fear comes up and then we start fighting the fear or adding things to it, I mean, it's not it's, just kind of adding to that flame that's, we're fanning it, and it's like we have choices of which flame to fan, and when we get fanning on that fear one or whatever it is. And I also love that analogy about the blanket of love being put over, because it also, like you said, just covering things is not really a thing. And it also made me think, like, you know that if I'm under my blanket and I'm nice and warm, there's that potential that my foot gets out and it gets cold, or it gets tangled in it, and it's not a perfect thing. Like, and it's then you get kind of then all of a sudden now you have fear that something's going to be exposed and I'm going to feel that cold again or whatever it is. So it is a good way of putting that. I really liked that a lot. Now, when you said you know adding kind of that space around those things, um, do you just and maybe just any practices that maybe like someone who's listening who isn't reading the spiritual text and stuff, like what is a way, physical pain, like you said, that's not easy. That can just throw, I mean, especially chronic and serious pain. Like, um, what do you, maybe what's a simple, and I don't want to say simple, but how would you create space?
Yeah. So sometimes the idea of loving our pain, it's like, what does that even mean? Right?
Right.
That can feel like, what do I even do with that? And which, by the way, that was one of Ram Dass's core practices. So something that's often not talked about, but if you have a stroke and you're in a wheelchair and part of your body doesn't work and you're just sitting all day, that involves a great deal of body pain. And Ram Dass had neuropathy, nerve pain. So in his toes, in the leg that like didn't work, he just felt pain there at all times. He had an active practice of loving his pain, like bringing that loving
Right.
awareness into the pain. So, so, so what that's another thing I learned from him is that loving awareness isn't just a state of consciousness that is who we really are, but it's also a practice. It's something that we can practice. But what to do when it feels like trying to love feels
Right.
like we're like struggling to do something that doesn't feel real. So curiosity can be a really great gateway. Because the moment that we're curious about an experience, we're not fighting with it.
Mm.
So let's just say body pain, because this is a really easy one. All feelings, like all emotional states, are sensations in the body that we can feel and inspect and be curious about. But body pain is much more obviously a sensation in the body, right? So, right now, in this moment, I'm feeling some body tension in my shoulder and neck, and I have a little bit of scoliosis. And so that's pretty much like always there, right? At least on a little level, a dull ache. So, what do I do for most of the day? Most of the day, I'm struggling with it. I'm like stretching. I'm like going like this. And actually, this felt really good. So,
Right.
I'm going to roll my neck. Um, and I'm standing in different ways and I'm fidgeting and I'm doing all those things. And there's not necessarily something wrong with that. If there's something I can do in the moment to feel better, then why wouldn't I do that? And constantly trying to get rid of a sensation involves a lot of energy. And sometimes that's just exhausting. So there's another way. I don't have to relate to my pain as something that I have to get rid of, or as a problem to be fixed, or as something that I'm frustrated with. It's actually a very tangible and real practice. I can practice being curious about it, right? So in this moment, this tension in my neck, where am I feeling it exactly, right? The neck's actually a pretty large object. Like where, right? Where is that sensation and what shape is it, right? And if I was like a scientist writing journal notes out in nature and I was trying to describe the texture of this dull ache in my neck, how would I describe it, right? Like, can I really get to know it? In the act of doing that, I'm being curious. And what that's doing, that act of being curious, I'm dropping the struggle with my experience in that moment,
Mm.
right? So, yeah, the tension's there, but I'm not struggling with the tension. I'm being curious about it. I'm actually getting more intimate with it. And so that creates a certain sense of space, right? And space is created anytime that we drop the struggle with our experience. It's the struggle. Actually, here's another really great metaphor. So, is this a video podcast or
Yeah,
only audio?
we'll do both. Yeah.
Great. So, I'll explain what I'm doing for the people listening, but this is a visual metaphor. So, I have this piece of paper here and I wrote the word anger on it. Okay. So I'm having an experience of anger and I'm struggling with it and I'm trying to get rid of it. I'm wrestling with it. I'm beating myself up over, oh, I shouldn't be feeling angry, or I just want to feel better. How can I feel better? Right. Or I'm really absorbed in it. Right. All of this right now, this act of either being caught in it or struggling with it, I can't actually see you.
Mm.
Right. Because I'm so focused on this, and I'm, for people listening, right, my hands, you can see they're very tight around this piece of paper and I'm struggling with it. And it's a lot of energy, right? So I can't actually be present with what matters right now, which is this interview. Versus if I let go of the struggle with it, right? If I just allow this anger to be here, I haven't gotten rid of it, but there's now a lot more space around it because now this anger is just sitting in my hands and it's not blocking my view, and I'm not using any energy to get rid of it or bring it closer. And because I'm not holding on to it now, it can much more easily dissipate on its own when the time comes. But also, even if it were to be here for this whole interview, let's say I was steaming,
Mm.
if I was really not attached to it, really not struggling with it, this anger doesn't have to get in the way at all with me being present with you in this moment, my compassionate heart, showing up to be of service to others. This anger can just be one little piece of my experience, but now I have all this room for other experiences and other possibilities. And so
Right.
that's what I mean by that.
Yeah, I like that. And I also like that in conjunction with what we talked about before, which is getting frustrated. Like you will tangle with the paper a little bit. Like sometimes it takes that tangle to be like, oh wait, I can just let this rest in my, yeah. And that's not obviously diminishing anyone's experience who can not get to that point right now, but it is like you kind of pointed out, the just that little perspective change is pretty powerful. It's similar to, I work at an office and there's a lot of day-to-day frustrations, and I see a lot of people come in already on fire, already ready to fight, and I see the difference in their perspective. And like you said, like if a client yells at somebody, even in that situation, they watching it curiously, watching my reaction, how it physically affects me, and being like, oh, okay, like I see that, and would really slow down the momentum of that the challenging feeling, because it's not that it's not going to be there. I'm still going to feel something if someone's like, you did bad, or like, or the
Yeah.
physical pain. So like the both of those things together I really like, um in terms of just working through being a person.
Yeah.
you
And
know
and we can, the thing is there's always something we can be curious about. So let's just say that we know that we're just pissed,
Mm.
and we're so pissed and so caught in it that like we don't even want to let go of it, right? I mean, we're
Mm.
really in it, really struggling. The idea of bringing like, fuck that, right?
Right.
I'm pissed. I'm going to stay pissed for another hour.
Yeah.
Like, we can be curious about that. Wow, look
Right.
how caught I am.
Yeah.
Wow, you
Yeah.
know, this is incredible, right?
Right.
So there's always something that we can be curious about if we're willing, and that's just it, right? It's knowing that there's another possibility can help us to let go a little bit sooner. And for
Right.
most of us, that's what we want because we don't
Mhm.
want to yell at our kids or yell at our coworkers or like we don't really want to do
No.
that.
No.
And so that's really the core of this is just how do we live a life more so in alignment with our deepest values, with what's important to us, with compassion, kindness, truth.
Right.
And that's where these practices, that's where it stops becoming so heady or intellectual. I mean, that's really, because that's something universal we all want. And
Mm.
that's ultimately what these practices help us do.
Right. Yeah. And I love, and it's cool because, compassion and these words that we always say that are really tightly connected to people talking about spirituality and values that are important. I love adding curiosity to that. I think
Mm,
that is such a good one because I don't think curiosity killed the cat. I think
mm,
especially now that you explained it that way, I love adding that to it because a lot of times you'll hear those examples of, oh, just be the witness, be the witness and, step, you're the person behind the thoughts. But that's so hard to kind of wrap your brain around sometimes, especially if you're talking to someone who's just frustrated at work. This is a person who's frustrated at work and they don't want to read Ram Dass. They're going to go watch Netflix and that's fine, but they're still frustrated. They're still a human and they're still struggling. And saying, oh, just be the witness. It's like sometimes that's it's not going to land, but just be curious about that. I mean, I've never looked at it that way. This is a brand new revelation for me, but I really like that. It feels more attainable. It feels more like, oh, I've been curious all the time.
yeah,
It's like a natural thing.
yeah. And check this out, right? If we're curious and we're doing so in a kind and gentle way, that could just be another way of saying loving awareness,
Mm,
right? So that curiosity, but what we're bringing with that curiosity is a sense of softness, a sense of gentleness, and we can approach these things in ourselves with a little bit of kindness,
right.
and that's workable, right? That's a real practice, right?
Mhm.
We know how to practice kindness towards others, and if we start with curiosity, we can learn pretty quick how to bring in a little bit more gentleness and ease and kindness towards the way that we relate to our own bodies, our own minds, our own emotions, so that we stop beating ourselves up so much.
Yeah, and I mean, that is major in just being a person, that letting go of constantly berating yourself. And what I love about curiosity, because now I'm stuck on it, just so you know,
Great.
and how you just expressed it, like when you said that, I pictured, like a toddler who's, outside and
Yeah.
they pick up a flower or they get down to look at a bug and they have it in their hand. How do they look at it? They look at it, it's all gentle and it's all right in their face, and they're just touching the leaf or they're blowing on whatever they're doing, however they explore it is so soft and so curious, just so there. And it's like, okay, that's the curiosity we bring. Like if we can
Yeah.
bring that toddler in the springtime softness, however you want to say it, like that's the image that as you talk just popped in my head. And I was like, man, that's a true thing.
Mm. Yeah. I love that. That's a
Yeah.
very it's a tangible metaphor, but also one that I felt as you were sharing that,
Mm,
right?
cool.
That's
Right. Yeah,
yeah.
because we were there. We were that
Yeah.
person. So I know we're approaching our time. So I always ask these two questions near the end.
Okay.
Um, one of which is just because I started this podcast, one of the reasons because it kept tapping me on the shoulder and I didn't know why. And I kept saying, go away, but it kept coming. And one of the reasons was just I wanted to share stuff like people that I thought had interesting or beneficial stories I wanted to share. And I also ask the guest if there's anything like, and sometimes it's music I want to share. Sometimes it's a book. People love to share. Look at the thing that changed me, or look at the thing that I like to do. If whether it's a walk in the forest, or it's a song, or it's whatever. So I always ask the guest if there's anything, just a suggestion. Whether, like I said, could be absolutely. It doesn't even have to be. It can be a practice. It can be a poem you like. It can be anything at all.
Mm. So, uh, yeah, just an open-ended suggestion. Just
Mhm.
like like what would I what would I suggest?
Mhm.
Okay, yeah, give me a second.
Yeah.
What's coming to me in this moment isn't necessarily tangible as an external thing, but this has been maybe the most important thing that I've learned on my path so far, that I keep learning and being reminded of again and again and again, which is that I really can trust myself, that we really can trust ourselves, that, yeah, we'll seek outside guidance, we'll do all of those things, employ the scientific method, look at various spiritual texts. But at the end of the day, it really is just the depth of our own being deciding what feels right to us, orienting our own compass about what direction we want to go, how we want to spend our time, and that there isn't actually some other outside external rule book.
Mhm.
It's all we have ultimately, and that we really can trust it.
Wow. I like that. And it's funny because we want a rule book. We wish that there was like one book. That's why I think we get so attached to belief systems because we're like, I
Mm,
just want all the answers. We want the answers in the back of the math book that just tell us, just let me fill it out and get the A plus and then I'll feel good. But we want that book, but it's actually like you said, like the just trust yourself being able to is better. And maybe you have your own um rule book, maybe you say I don't know how to express that exactly, but we want that so bad. We want to have that all the answers in something, but they're just not it's not that easy. All our tests have different questions almost, so there's no answer
yeah.
sheet. Um
Yeah, and it's a lot of these rule books were made thousands of years ago, and look, I'm someone, I find great value in that. If there's something that people have found value in thousands of years ago and still find value in today, that's a sign to me that I
mhm.
want to inspect that, right? But this is a unique moment, and I'm a unique being, and this moment is unique from the last moment, and I'm allowed to change my mind. I'm allowed to disagree with wise beings. Yeah,
Wow. Yeah, I mean those, and I'm allowed to change my mind and I'm allowed to disagree with wise beings is, I mean, it's said so simply, but man, that's a struggle. That's hard to do and hard to recognize that, because I'll read the Vedanta text. That's been kind of my focus for the last year or so, and sometimes I'm like, I don't get that, or it doesn't sit right, or something. And then I'll just be like, well, no, I've just kept it, and it's this conflict internally where I'm supposed this is right. It says this is what everybody in the temple thinks. So I have to understand it too.
yeah,
Sometimes it's just not the case. So
yeah.
it's nice to hear that said that, yeah, I can change my mind. I can go from this to that, and I can also not agree with it all.
Yeah. I, like I said before, there were some ways when I was younger when maybe I could have used my time with Ramdas more effectively. And like one example is that there's sometimes he would say things and I didn't fully understand it or didn't know if I agreed, but I didn't want to look stupid in that
Mm,
moment, or I didn't want to challenge him or whatever. And but like I know he could handle all of that, and there's a few things that I still like think about, like what did he mean by that, and
mm,
uh, what if I just allowed myself to just be like, what are you talking about?
right.
You know, yeah,
That's so good.
yeah. And the other thing I'll share about that, this is a very quick story. When
Mhm.
I moved into Ramnas's house, one of the things I really wanted and that I thought I was getting was because I was so on fire for God and so on fire for the spiritual path. And I didn't feel like I had any direction. I was like, finally, like, I'll go somewhere. Someone will tell me what to do this practice and this practice and this practice. And then I'll just do it. And then that's it. Right. And I got there, and there wasn't one time the entire time I was there that Ram Dass ever told me what to do.
Mm,
He would encourage me when he saw me do certain things, and I could ask him questions, right, about my practice, but he never once told me what to do. And furthermore, the few times when like he kind of gave certain bits of advice, or maybe he felt like I was going to too many ayahuasca ceremonies or
mhm.
whatever it was, I didn't even listen to him.
Right. So you were going to
So,
follow your compass anyway.
yeah, so that. And then the other little piece is that I've worked with a lot of people in grief. And because grief really strips away like everything we thought we knew, it's a really common experience. Those are times when it really feels like we can't trust ourselves.
Mm,
And that's one of the things I've learned is one of the most healing things that many people hear is that like you really can. Even though it's scary and this is unknown and the ground beneath your feet has fallen away and sometimes you don't know up from down, still, even now, like you really can trust yourself and you are being guided.
right. I like that a
Yeah.
lot. So last question, and I might be curious. I might know where you might go. I'm not sure. We'll see. We'll see. So you're familiar with Peter Pan, the story of Peter Pan,
Sure.
right? And the Lost Boys go to Neverland and they get some pixie dust, and then they think of their happy thought, the thing that just brings allows joy inside of them, and that's what allows them to fly. Um, if you are Neverland bound and you had your happy thought, what's the thing, the joy? Where does it potentially come from?
Hmm. So it's interesting because your
Mhm.
last question maybe yielded a more tangible answer and I gave a more abstract answer.
Right.
And this question maybe seems like it would yield to a more abstract answer. And I actually have a more tangible answer, which
Cool.
is one of my core practices is my internal mantra practice, where I'm just reciting the name of God over and over again. And I've been doing that throughout this conversation. And I try and keep it going throughout the day. And that's the practice I do. I do my practices at night. And it's to constantly remind myself of God through the holy name, one of the names of God. And that it's not necessarily a happy place.
Hmm.
It's a place that's deeper than any emotional state, but it is bliss filled.
Mm.
And there's a few other reminders, Neem Karoli Baba, right? My guru, the guru of the lineage that I'm in, who is said to be a siddha, a perfected being, right? So, like the holy name, something that's said to be a mirror of loving awareness of my true nature, I can pull an image of him in my mind, and it accomplishes that. And since Ram Dass died, I mean, I've been looking over a couple of times. I see that picture of Ram Dass
Mm,
you have on your wall.
right.
But since he died, really, when I look in his eyes on a picture or in my mind, uh, it really is a. I mean, it's deeper than a happy place,
Mm.
but um, but it really does serve as a gateway there. And so that is my core practice: is to try and remember that which is deeper than a happy place.
It's a perfect answer. And what I really like is you reminded me of another Peter Pan detail that I had totally forgotten, and I had forgotten through the first 10 episodes of this, is that I believe one of the characters, Happy Thought, was his mother. And as you
Mm,
started saying, the name of God and that thing um beyond feelings, um I the mother, this, universal mother, you could put it, this, whether however you want to express that, a lot of belief systems, see the mother in is the form of God. And so
mm-hmm,
I heard that little, like, your explanation in the character where it's like, oh, I think of my mother. And it's just like, oh
mm,
wow, that it connected for me for some reason.
mm. I love that. Yeah,
Yeah. So,
I feel that.
well, is there anything else you'd like to share? Just anything at all?
Sure. Well, if I could, for just a couple minutes, just talk about some of the things that I'm actively involved in
Yeah,
right now.
I probably had some written down, but I didn't want to take your time. So now go for it. Yeah.
Sure. So, all of my personal creative offerings, in terms of my books, teachings, music, all of that is offered through the Sacred Community Project, which is it's a service organization that I'm the director of. And that's really where all my time and attention is going in. And even though I'm putting all my time and attention in it, the organization is bigger than just me. And so it's an inner spiritual service and art collective that works to lower the barriers of access to contemplative and devotional practices through low cost, free, and donation based offerings. We do a lot of service and outreach to the prison system, and we offer donation based spiritual support to anyone who reaches out. And it's basically the idea is to really make these spiritual teachings truly accessible in a way that can start to, in its own way, right, within its own sphere of influence, start to create some new channels within our overall cultural structure, right? Because right now, largely, the spiritual teachings come through social media, come through capitalism, and that's the container that we're in. And so, just trying to create some other avenues for these teachings to come through, so that it's truly nourishing and accessible to all. So we have spiritual support groups that meet on a regular basis, one-on-one spiritual support, and we have active volunteer trainings for people that want to develop themselves on the spiritual path, on the path of service, but don't know how to do it or want to find some more skills or be a part of a community of other people that want service to be a central part of their spiritual path. These are all the things that the Sacred Community Project is involved in. And so if anyone's interested in any of that, interested in either my own offerings, wanting to explore more of that, or just interested in any of the things I just mentioned, or wants to support us in any way, we can take tax deductible donations. They can go to sacredcommunityproject.org.
Cool. Cool. And I'll throw all the links in there and everything. It's very cool that you're doing all that, and that you kind of took the path you took and are now involved, like really involved in trying to give that to people, you know? And I just think that's very cool. So thank you for everything that you've done. And thank you for being on. I really enjoyed this. It was interesting because typically a lot of times I'm engaged with the guest, but I'm also thinking about how I can connect to the next questions and being a host, right?
Uh-huh.
You know, because I had interview experience before the podcast, and it was always be ready, you know, for the next thing. I did not feel that during this at all.
Huh.
And I noticed little shreds of fear every once in a while where it was just like, you don't have anything planned. You better, you better. And then, I just have the word listen really big on the top of my notes with exclamation points. And I'm very happy how this turned out following that versus my stay a step ahead version. So I
Mm.
I appreciate you kind of facilitating that with me.
Thanks for sharing that. And no, I mean, this was a great interview. I
Cool.
felt really good about being here and meeting you.
Cool.
And yeah, really, I mean, just thanks for having
Yeah.
me.
No problem. No problem. Well, I will talk to you later. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah.
Bye.